Alright, now let's see the difference between a real-time operating system and a general-purpose operating system in terms of task switching latency. In computing, latency means the time that elapses between a stimulus and the response to it. Task switching latency means that time gap between a triggering of an event and the time at which the task which takes care of that event is allowed to run on the CPU. Take example of this scenario. Let's say at T1 a event is triggered or occurred. That could be a crash detection. And at T2 task which handles that crash detection, like a airbag deployment task, is made to run on the CPU. Okay, so this time gap is called a task switching latency. In the case of RTOS, this latency is always fine-tuned and bounded. The real-time operating systems always helps you to design such types of system where this gap must be deterministic or time bounded. No matter when this event occurs, this gap will always remain almost constant. But this is not the case of general purpose operating system, where this gap varies as time elapses or the system load increases. Take a look into this graph. As the number of tasks that get scheduled increases, the switching latency for a task increases in the case of a general purpose operating system, but in the case of RTOS, it remains almost constant. In the case of general purpose operating system, when more number of threads or processes to schedule, latency will get added up. Now let's discuss about differences between RTOS and a GPOS in terms of interrupt latency. Interrupt latency is the time gap between the time at which interrupt triggers and the time at which ISR is started executing on the CPU. Let's say task 1 is running on CPU and at time T1 interrupt occurs. If it's a higher priority, then it will preempt this task and ISR will begin to execute. So this time gap between T1 and T2 is called interrupt latency. This interrupt latency is an important parameter to service the critical events. For example, in our airbag deployment application, this gap must be in terms of microseconds or nanoseconds. So interrupt latency is an important characteristic of the RTOS. And our RTOS should be having this latency as minimal as possible. And in GPOS, this time gap varies as system load increases and it is unbounded. When the ISR finishes, now it has to make a switch to higher priority task which is ready in the system, isn't it? So when it finishes here, either old task can resume which got interrupted due to ISR, only if it is the highest priority ready task, or it may switch to some other task which is higher priority at this time. So the time gap between the moment at which ISR or task leaves the CPU and the time at which new task switching into the CPU is called scheduling latency. In this time gap, various activities take place, like saving the context of an old task and retrieving that context of the new task, which we call context switching. And for a real-time application, this scheduling latency must be very narrow. So this time gap must be very small as possible, and that is one of the characteristic of the real-time operating system. So to conclude this, both the scheduling latency and the interrupt latency of the RTOS is bounded, and it won't increases as the system load increases. But in the GPOS, it is unbounded, and the latency may vary as the system load increases. And don't worry about the terminologies I used in this slide, like task switching in, switching out, context switching, preemption, etc. as of now. As you make a progress in the course, you will understand all these terminologies, concepts much better along with the code exercises. So let's move forward. So in the next lecture, let's see the difference between RTOS and GPOS in terms of priority inversion.